Welcome everyone. It's great to see so many of you already checking in. I really appreciate that greatly. Super excited to be here. In fact, I've been looking forward to this all summer, getting ready for not just this kind of the semester that's upcoming, but this study itself. Ever since last year, I've just been kind of over the moon excited about it. And so grateful for all of you that are tuning in. And those of you that will watch after the fact, that's one of the things I learned last year is how many tune in after the fact, which has been just fantastic. And so grateful for your presence tonight, grateful for you being here, grateful for you watching later at a different time. At any point in time, let me know where you're coming from. So you can put it in the chat and the rest. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Love to know that. Last year, I think in the end, we counted close to 36 different states and quite a few different countries too that watched after the fact. And so I'm just so grateful for your presence and for your joining us through this study. For those of you who don't know me, you may know me just through Facebook and the rest. My name is Brandon Edwards, and I am the campus minister at Ohio State University, and I should say the Ohio State University. It's one of those things you get in trouble for around here if you don't say it. I'm also one of the ministers at the Church of Christ on Fishinger Road. I've also kind of traveled all over the world. And so I'm just grateful to join in with you all. I see people from Washington State. I definitely know I've got some that are in Oklahoma and other places that are joining in. I know we've got a couple from Ohio that are here already that I've seen. And just grateful for you guys being here. This is really fun. I'm looking forward to this study and this walk through this book quite a bit. And so I've got some things I want to walk through with you just really quickly. And so you'll see me moving around the screen at times, especially with some of these slides and the rest. You'll see me kind of over here, and other times you'll see me move over here. I'm trying to do my best to give you guys some visual representations of some of these really fantastic works that we get to study through. If you haven't had a chance to yet, I hope you will get a copy of the book. In fact, I'll zoom back out here so you can see. This is the basic copy. I dropped the link in the first ever in the group, and I'll do it also on this video later if you want to, just from Amazon. I think I was getting these for like $9. We were able to get them, and so fantastic books, fantastic version of the book in and of itself. Obviously, there's a few different versions, not necessarily translations, just different layouts, things of that nature. And so I'm super excited. If you've got one already, if you had a chance, I put a breakdown in the Rabbit Hole group that actually has all of the weeks, what we're going to be studying each week, because the one thing about a book, and especially with a study and an online study, you might feel a little bit overwhelmed by the idea of trying to jump into the depths of this book and not knowing where to go with it and not knowing what to see and how to read it in some form or fashion, especially with some of the old English that is often there. And so I didn't want you to get kind of overwhelmed by that. So instead, the invitation is we're just going to break it down. And it goes back to kind of one of those old sayings is, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. And so that's what we're doing. And so inside the group, and I'll put it in the chat here later, I actually posted a breakdown of the 14 weeks that we'll be walking through this all the way up, basically every Thursday, all the way up to the week before Thanksgiving, that we'll be doing this each night, each Thursday night. Super excited about that. So glad to have you guys joining in. I think I see, yes, Judy has joined us from Dalton, Georgia. So grateful for your presence all the way down in Georgia. So Georgia, Washington, Ohio, Oklahoma, we're all over the world already, all over the United States. So that's fantastic. So the Rabbit Hole study, for those of you who are new, and there are quite a few that are new, I'll just give you kind of a brief overview of kind of what it is. And so Rabbit Hole study, in essence, is just my invitation to kind of from Lewis Carroll to go down the rabbit hole, chasing down different topics. You can go back and look at old videos from last year and things that we did. Totally different topics, completely different scenarios than what we're dealing with this semester. This semester, we're going through a fantastic book by C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, whereas in the past, we did individual topics each week, from critical race theory to intersectionality to all sorts of different types of topics, from gender identity to climate change as a Christian. So a lot of heavy academic topics. And so this fall, we're doing this book, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's less of a heavy topic. In fact, I think it's far more pertinent in a lot of ways, even though those topics we covered last semester were rich and deep along the way. That's where we began. So this is a shift, in essence, in culture and how we've dealt with this group. But we meet every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. I am in the Eastern time zone is where I'm at. And so I know that there are some who cannot because they're Pacific time or they're somewhere else, and so it's too early in the day, or they're just getting off work or just getting out of class, and so they watch after the fact. So I'm grateful for all those that do that. But we meet 7 p.m. Eastern. We go through these things. We're in the group. A lot of people asked, could we share the videos out? And so the answer to that is yes. So thus, this is now live on my own personal page, but at the same time, it's shared in the group, and so you can be part of it both ways. I see Lauren is tuned in from Cleveland, Tennessee. That's awesome. So Tennessee is in the house also, the volunteer state. That's been home for my family and others. We lived there for 4 years, and obviously I was in college there, and so I love the people from Tennessee. So this is what we're doing, what the goal is and where we're at right now. And so I was trying to think of what would be a good way to start this all off. And the best way I know how to start is really to give you a background of the person. I'm just going to assume, and I hope you'll allow me to do this, that you may not know much about C.S. Lewis outside of the fact that you've heard his name, or you may have read the kind of the children's books that have been out there, Chronicles of Narnia and some of the others, or you may just know him as kind of a historical literary figure. And that is absolutely fine. But in this study, we want to kind of dive in a little deeper and see what we can find from there. And Lewis is one of my favorite literary characters as a writer and an author, but also as an individual. His personal story in his life is truly fascinating. And I'll give you a little tidbit later on something that I learned something that happened later on in my life that really connected me to him in this way. So with that in mind, I'm going to move myself around here a little bit, as you can see, and just give you some very basic background to C.S. Lewis. And you can put this in the chat if you know this. How many of you knew his actual name is Clive Staples Lewis? And so put that in the chat if you knew that. There's a lot of people who just kind of know him as C.S. Lewis, and they're not really sure what the initials stood for, but his name was Clive Staples Lewis was his name. And so I've got some stuff on the front end here about his death, and then we'll go through his life also, mainly because there's just a fascinating aspect of this date that he dies on, that he actually passes away. How many of you know what the importance of November 22nd, 1963 is? It was just a week before his 65th birthday, and his works continue to be widely read all over. And so I kind of need to know if you know what the importance of that date is, November 22nd, 1963. I will wait and get it in the chat. There's obviously a little bit of a delay at times here, but if you had the assassination of President Kennedy, that would be the date. In fact, it was a fairly monumental date historically, and so his death, I think, would have been far more noted in newspapers and the rest across the world had it not happened at the same time with the assassination of an American president. And so fascinating little historical tidbit that happened there. But let's go back to kind of the beginning of his life here. He is actually most known as Jack. That was the name that his friends called him. He was known as Jack C.S. Lewis, obviously as a writer, but Jack was what he was most known as. All of his friends would call him that. Was a British writer. He was a scholar and a Christian apologist. Now, this is a little bit interesting in noting that because he didn't necessarily see himself as a theologian nearly as much as he was an academic, and he was an author, and he was a writer in those areas. He saw himself just kind of as a Christian, which is what I love. There was a lot of humility to the man when it came to apologetic works. He is obviously perhaps best known for his works of fiction, particularly the Chronicles of Narnia series, as well as contribution to Christian apologetics and literature on the whole. In fact, he is really known worldwide as one of the top authors in the 19th and 20th century, in essence. So he was born in November 29th, 1898 in Belfast, Ireland, which is now Northern Ireland. He was the second son of Albert and Lewis and Florence Augusta Hamilton Lewis. His early childhood was tragic in a lot of ways. It was marked by the death of his mother when he was just 9 years old, which deeply affected his spiritual life and his spiritual understanding of God. In fact, it caused him to turn his back on God very early on in life. He attended quite a few various different schools, but he was always a brilliant when it came to reading and writing. And off of that, he went to Malvern College. Malvern College is a boarding school still around today, one of the top boarding schools in all of the UK. It's very well known. And then he served in World War I. In fact, World War I is kind of the arena that ultimately really impacted his life, and especially his spiritual life, to a point where he became, in essence, a full-blown atheist during that time period because of the atrocities and the things that he witnessed during World War I. After the war, he pursued higher education, attending University College, Oxford, where he eventually became a fellow and a tutor in English literature. He was a tutor in classics, so medieval literature. And his academic interests spanned literature, philosophy, medieval studies, and he became a renowned scholar in these fields and was known for his engaging teaching style. And he was a well-known teacher on his on daily works with his students along the way. His conversion to Christianity is a fascinating one. In fact, there is a wonderful movie that's called The Most Reluctant Convert that you can go and see now. It's truly fantastic, and I highly recommend it. And it kind of walks through some of the things that he experienced and dealt with during that time of his conversion. But he was initially an atheist due to his childhood trauma and then World War I, and then later on went a significant spiritual journey that led him to embrace Christianity. His conversion was influenced by his friendships with fellow scholars such as, and a lot of people may or may not know this, but J.R.R. Tolkien, and discussions with other Christian intellectuals. So some of you may know that name. J.R.R. Tolkien is most famous for his authorship of the great and fantastic novels, The Lord of the Rings, the trilogy series there, and the rest. And he and Lewis were dear friends and spent quite a bit of time working together in those realms, especially in literature and art, but also in Christianity and faith. And Lewis's Christian faith obviously later on would play a central role in his writings after his conversion, quite a bit, in fact. So just a few of the other literary works. He was a prolific writer, writing on a wide range of topics, include Chronicles of Narnia. Chronicles of Narnia, still one of my favorite series of all time. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just as a starting point, just bathed in Christianity. There's so many Christian themes all through it, Aslan and Jesus and the rest. You can just kind of see it through all of that. But he was also known for his science fiction, which was the Space Trilogy, The Great Divorce, which was an allegorical work, and Till We Have Faces, which is a fantastic work also. Now, we're more this semester diving into obviously one book, Mere Christianity, which is his nonfiction items, but he has quite a bit of fictional works. And in the spring, I've been toying around with doing the Screw Tape Letters, which are just a fantastic nonfiction work, but they seem very real because of what it is. So the problem of pain and philosophical essays, literary criticism that he goes through, also just fantastic, rich, deep, meaningful works. Highly recommend them all. Later on, like I said, his most best known in the realm is his persuasive defense of Christian faith. Mere Christianity is one of the most famous works in this genre, without a doubt, that presents rational arguments for the existence of God, the divinity of Jesus Christ, and the moral framework of Christianity. I can't sell this enough, especially in the light of all of the different things that were going on during this time period, World War II and the rest, and just had a massive influence. And David, yeah, I absolutely see this. I'd do Abolition of Man would be a fantastic. In fact, I've got a scholar that I've become friends with that's at the University of Oxford that I think would be fantastic to actually kind of do a series that I might invite him to join us on one of those talks along the way. It's a fantastic work. So how did it all begin? Where did Mere Christianity come from? And what a lot of people don't necessarily know is that it all started actually as a radio program. BBC came to Lewis and asked him specifically if he would be willing to give a series of talks on the topic of Christianity as a part of kind of their efforts to provide moral and spiritual encouragement during the war. Lewis was already well known. His books had already been out and the rest, and so they wanted to see if he would be willing to do some talks to encourage the local people with what everything was going on at the time. And this kind of grew from that, and this became one of his major legacy works off of it. But it's always fascinated me that it started off as a radio work, which is why it reads different than a lot of the other works, because it was written to be almost spoken, to be performed, not necessarily to just be read. Just before I get into the whole depth of that, I also want to note something that about his personal life that I find fascinating. And this is another one that might go into Abolition of Man and A Grief Observed and some of the other great works of his. Later on, he formed a great friendship with an American writer by the name of Joy Davidman Gresham, and their relationship later developed into a marriage. Now, there's a whole side story to that, which is quite fascinating, that I will probably get into one of the other nights. And tragically, she died of cancer, and Lewis then wrote his book, A Grief Observed. But he had two sons, and they were his stepsons. They were her children from a previous marriage, and had the pleasure of meeting one of those sons on the Isle of Malta quite a few years ago when I was living in southern Italy. And meeting him made it really real. Meeting the actual stepson of C.S. Lewis made just that connecting point in history became one of those moments that really caused me to dive a little bit deeper into his life, which became part of my fascination with his works and the rest, and leads me to where we are. So that was that little thing I thought I would share with you guys. Why it became such a real connection for me was actually meeting his stepson. He was a wonderful, wonderful man there on the Isle of Malta. And so these nature of these talks that he put out were presenting a rational, accessible explanation for Christian beliefs and ethics. He aimed to provide a common ground of core Christian ideas that could be understood and appreciated by people from various denominations and even by those who were not already Christians. Now, that in and of itself is just an unbelievably tough thing to try to do, but that's what he set forth to do. And I love that. I love that that was kind of the goal. But that's a very tough thing to do. And so this was between 1942 and 1944. Lewis delivered a total of 4 series of talks. A lot of times we say 3 because some of them happened, 2 of them happened right in March and April of 1942, I believe. And so it was very close together, but they were in essence almost 4 different ones. And to give you kind of a visual representation of what that looked like, was August 1941 was the first broadcast, March 1942 was the second. I divided up as the third in 1942 of April, and then January 1943 was the fourth broadcast. And these kind of reflects the radio broadcasts of the BBC. Obviously, these were prepared a little bit ahead of time. And the transcripts of these talks were later compiled by Lewis to then create the actual book itself. And so the first broadcast kind of focused on the right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And so these were presented on August 11th, 1941 and August 18th of 1941, which was right and wrong and what Christians believe. The second one was on what Christians believe, and this was in March of 1942. And you see Christian behavior, social morality, Christian morality, morality and psychoanalysis, and then sexual morality. The third one was again on Christian behavior, and you can kind of see why the 2 and 3 were kind of put together, because this is March, April, so at once a week in essence. The 3 parts of morality, social morality, morality and psychoanalysis, and then sexual morality again. And then beyond personality, or first steps in the doctrine of the Trinity, was the third one later on, which was making and begetting, the 3 personal God, and the invasion. And so all of these were put out as radio broadcasts. I will share in the YouTube group and possibly even on my page at a different time. You can actually go and listen to these old BBC radio addresses. You can hear his voice live. It's fascinating to hear that and his accent and the things and the ways that he spoke, and to even follow along at times. And obviously there are some differences. He notes that in the preface of the book, that there are some differences in things that he changed. But it really is neat to hear that live viva voce, the live voice of C.S. Lewis as he speaks forth this book and what he set forward. So after the war was over, it was adapted. Friends came to him and listeners said, "You really should compile this into a book." Lewis finally agreed and set about the task of adapting and expanding the transcripts of the talks into a cohesive written work. And I don't know about you, but I'm incredibly grateful that he took the time to do such a thing. So the publication, actually these were revised, edited, were finally put in 1952, and it was published as a single volume that captured the essence of Lewis's radio broadcast. The book's title, Mere Christianity, reflects Lewis' intention to present the foundational common principles of the Christian faith. So oftentimes we think of it as a book title, and it's far more representative of what his intent was. Not necessarily like, here's a great title, a catchy title or something along the way. He wanted it to be mere Christianity. And one of the things that's always resonated to me as someone who has grown up in the restoration movement, that in and of itself, the premise of speak where the Bible speaks, we're silent where the Bible is silent, where no creed but the Bible, those types of premises of this simplicity, mere Christianity, has always resonated with me. And so this book in and of itself, the goal of it seems to be the constant desire to find the simple things, the simple truths that are in Scripture, and to elevate those above the noise of what often can distract us along the way. So what does that look like? Obviously, I mentioned that this has become one of the top books in history. The book's accessible style, its logical arguments, and emphasis on moral values continues to make it relevant. Here we are, 2023, and you and I are going through this book, and hopefully you have an opportunity to read it and to look at it and see so many fantastic things that you may not have ever seen before, or even some arguments you may not have heard in a while. It's such a fantastic thing to be able to do that together. The value of this book still to this day is truly without measure. So just a quick guide through the preface of this book. So you might ask, why are we starting off with the preface? Well, for one, we kind of have to start off and give some background. So this week I wanted to start off with some background, but I also wanted to dive into where this came, why this came about, what it is. And so I kind of titled this Unraveling the Mysteries and Gems of the Preface, because the intent of the author is so important. You see, we often dismiss the intent of the author, or we add our own idea of what he meant along the way. We interpret so much from the writings of others that it's truly fascinating to be able to stop for a minute and go, what did he mean? And based off of what he meant, then I can interpret off of that. And Lewis actually dives straight into this, and he has probably one of my favorite quotes, and it's not one that you can quote outright, but it's one that I love, just where he states, "This is what I mean, and please don't read anything else into anything besides that." And so we're going to go through a few things, but let's go through a breakdown real quick of kind of the explanation in the preface. Lewis begins by explaining the term mere Christianity. He clarifies that he is not presenting it as an alternative to specific Christian denominations or creeds, but rather as a common ground that encompasses the essential beliefs shared by various Christian traditions. He likens it to a hall with doors leading to different rooms representing different Christian denominations. Now, I want to be very clear about this. It's not necessarily that I disagree with Lewis or that I agree with Lewis on this. What he is ultimately trying to do is saying, this is not a book about doctrine. I'm not here to argue all of the things that make us different. I'm trying to bring forth from Scripture and from the rest the mere Christianity, the simplest form, so that can be looked at. He's saying, look, I know that there's all these other things that might come in, and yes, you can bring in all this. What I'm simply trying to put forth is the beauty and the simplicity of this. And so what he's actually saying is, I don't want to spend time on these other things because it will be a distraction from what I believe is mere Christianity. And in that, I agree. I think there's beauty to that. I also think, and Lewis kind of notes this himself, he's not dismissing that those things don't matter. They do matter. He's just saying that's not the point of this book. That's not the point of these talks. I'm not trying to debate all those things right now. What I'm trying to do is give you the simplest beauty and simplicity of Christianity. And so that's what he sets forth to do. Lewis emphasizes the importance of Christian behavioral and moral choices throughout this book. He mentions that Christianity is not merely a set of beliefs to hold, but a way of life that involves conscious decisions and actions. He alludes to the concept of watch and pray as integral to Christian behavior. Lewis also introduces the idea that small everyday decisions have significant consequences for the person. He uses the metaphor of compound interest to illustrate how good and evil both accumulate over time, stressing the importance of making virtuous choices consistently. And practical theology, this is one of the key components. Lewis asserts that theology, the study of God and religious doctrine, is practical and relevant, particularly in the modern world. He suggests that historically, simple ideas about God might have sufficed, but increased education and discussion demand a more comprehensive understanding. And yes, Joshua, I really do think he does a fantastic job keeping the focus on what he wanted to, not getting distracted by all of the, ironically, rabbit holes he could have run down, chased after all over the place. And so I'm grateful that he stuck to the task of what he had before him. Also spends a lot of time on pride, identifies pride as a fundamental source of human misery. And boy, if there's that isn't as relevant today as it was in his day, it's fascinating to see that how that's continued to grow in that way. The preface concludes with an appeal to the reader's open-mindedness and willingness to engage with the ideas presented in the book. Lewis invites readers to approach the text with a receptive attitude, even if they do not initially agree with the content. And that is that invitation is very teacherly of him. It's very much the scholar, the professor, the inviter, the invitation. It's such a fascinating way that he does that, and I really do love the fact that he says, "Don't give up on this yet. Give me some time. I'll like to put this forth for you a little bit more." So let's do some things together. In fact, I've got some quotes that I've picked out and one longer passage that I want to read together tonight. And so I'm going to set these forward for you so that we can have possibly some discussion. So please add to the chat. Please feel free. And if you see these things that I put before you and you have comments on them, yes, there may be a delay, but I will definitely come back to it and look at it and the rest. I can see the comments popping up at times along the way. I want you to feel like you can jump in on this along the way. This first one, especially in the preface of this book, always jumped out to me. It says, "The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations." This goes back to kind of the point we were just making a second ago. He's basically saying, if you came here to see if I agree with you, that's not my point. Or if you came to this book wanting to use this to disprove someone else's theology in this point, that's not my point. I'm trying to go to the lowest common denominator. And there is a lot of things in theology where I don't recommend that as a practice. But I love this in this because it focuses on what ultimately matters. What are the things that are the paramount aspects of what Christianity is? And that's what he's setting forth. And so I love that he states this very clearly. The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. So if you come into this and goes, Lewis is one of us, which people were known to do. And can we be honest? We do this. We do this with preachers we like or speakers that we like or, with people that are actors and actresses. Oh, did you know that they're a Christian or they're a member of the church or they're this? We do this all the time trying to take claim, and his is purely of this is about the topic at hand. I'm not here to debate all those other things. And I think that there's a fascinating aspect to that. In that, he actually kind of goes deeper and he says this: "Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only, service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times." I love the simplicity of this, that ever since I became a Christian, I thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. So you might say, well, what are those things? Well, we're going to get into that in the book as we go through the chapters and the rest. But candidly, it's Jesus, it's the crucifixion, it's the resurrection, it's the things of life, it's morality, and that God has set before us salvation. All of those basic tenets are what he elevates consistently. And I love that he directly notes this because it's how he lived his life on a daily basis. So off of that, he goes to the second part where he says, in the first place, the questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of what he calls high theology or even ecclesiastical history, which ought never to be treated except by real experts. And yes, Kim, that is exactly what we should all be doing. You're 100% right on that one. So this quote here, what I find so fascinating is that he kind of differentiates that there are things that he calls high theology or ecclesiastical history, which ought never to be treated except for by real experts. And so this is a fascinating aspect to say that there are things that are debated that should be debated by people who have studied them. This is ultimately what he means. People who have spent time in deep personal study of maybe even the Greek language, the Hebrew, and the rest, there are concepts and ideas that should, and by his argument, should only be studied by those who have spent the time to actually study them. Otherwise, there are a lot of people, and if we brought this into the 21st century, I often call them Google theologians. They have an answer to everything because they can Google it, but they've spent no time studying it. They've spent all their time just Googling it and finding it within half a heartbeat, and they'll find something that agrees with what they already think is real, and that's what they put forth as their opinion, as their thoughts. And so Facebook theologians, Google theologians, and the rest, this is the distinction he's making between those who have spent actual time discussing it. So he's saying it's not that they shouldn't be discussed, but it should be discussed by people who've spent time actually studying it. So yes, Facebook scholars would be another way of putting that. Absolutely, Joshua. And so then the second part that he lays into, it says, and secondly, I think we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold. And this is, I think, goes back to even what Kim was saying a minute ago, that the simplicity, the beauty of Scripture can so often be where we start putting the cart before the horse. There are things that do matter to theology, but they will not matter to someone's salvation in the moment if they do not know Christ. If they don't know him at all, then all the other points that one might bring in later, it's like you're giving a child a steak dinner without giving him the skim milk that he needs to nourish and grow. And so this concept of we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold. I love this quote. And Joshua, yeah, I agree with you. This is one of my favorite quotes from this opening section. So off of that, here's another one that I wanted to note to you is, and I love this, is so far as I know, and this is the quote that I was telling you earlier that's just one of those that just fascinates me. He says, so far as I know, these were my only motives, and I should be very glad if people would not draw fanciful inferences from my silence on certain disputed matters. Candidly, I think I'm going to finish every paper and everything I ever write in my life with this right here. This may be the stamp I put on the back of any book I ever write, an article, whatever it may be, because this simple moment is, please don't read too much into my silence in what I'm not saying, because I can't say everything I might want to say, but instead I'm going to focus on that which I believe needs to be said in this moment. And if I could be candid with you, this happens to me all the time. On social media and different places, I constantly get asked, hey, would you say something about this? Or why don't you write about this? Or why have you never written about this or said about these things? And my response typically has been, that's not what's been on my heart. That's not what's been on my mind. Or I don't know enough about that. I haven't spent time studying that. I don't have an in-depth understanding of those things. And so don't take my silence as somehow permissive or my silence as somehow, yes, this is fine. But instead, I can only deal with so many things at so many times. And I try to do my best, much like Lewis does here, to focus on that which is the task at hand. And if I could give us kind of an encouragement from as Christians, as believers, that to be focused on the task at hand, so much of the nonsense of this world falls to the wayside when that becomes our focus. When the simplicity and beauty of the gospel, telling people about the good news of Jesus Christ, when that becomes the ultimate goal, that simplicity is truly beautiful. The other things will have their moments. They always do. But they often take precedence over the simplicity of the gospel. And so, as I noted, this may become a mantra of mine. So far as I know, these were my only motives, and I should be very glad if people would not draw fanciful inferences from my silence on certain disputed matters. Off of that, he has a couple other ones that I want to dive in with you here. He says, oddly enough, you cannot even conclude from my silence on disputed points, either that I think them important or that I think them unimportant, for this is itself one of the disputed points. One of the things Christians are disagreed about is the importance of their disagreements. And this is a little bit of his wit and a little bit of his kind of charm in writing. He basically follows right up with what he just said, and he said, weirdly enough, you can't even conclude based off of my silence if I agreed or didn't agree. In fact, that's one of the things we can't agree on. You can't agree if I disagreed or agreed. And he goes, and it's these very things that we disagree on. And I love his little charm and wit. And I put this in here so you could catch at times, because we can just skip right over these and miss these little philosophical arguments that he makes that says, this is how absurd it would be for you to tell me what I believe or what I'm saying through my silence. And I absolutely love this little quote. He also says this. And this is where I think gives us a flavor of the book of how he went about doing this. It says, the danger clearly was that I should put forward as common Christianity anything that was peculiar to the Church of England, or worse still, to myself. I tried to guard against this by sending the original script of what is not now Book 2 to 4 clergymen, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, and asking for their criticism. So here's what you need to know, that he actually set forth these 4 things to this books to these 4 different backgrounds to have them give him criticisms back about this. Now, so what he's basically saying is, I'm trying to set forth that which is common Christianity, not Church of England or worse still even his own, but just that which is common. And so he got feedback from different groups of people. Very, very important to note that he was doing his best to hear from all different sides, while at the same time proposing something that is very simple. And yes, Isaac, yes, why? As we'll try to avoid posting anything online condemning the latest atrocity. Absolutely. But at the same time, our silence does not mean acceptance, or our non-vocalization of something that people feel like you should condemn does not necessarily mean acceptance of that either. Absolutely. And so I do love that he kind of notes this fact that he is not. He is being very particular about making sure that he listens to other perspectives and that he hears from them. And he got feedback from them. He notes this. And he said, and there was just 1 or 2 things along the way, but ultimately they were all able to kind of see that his mere Christianity that he was putting forth was something that they could all agree upon. And so I have a longer quote that I want to read tonight. And if you want to turn in the book, follow along, you're welcome to. It's on page, technically it's the Roman numeral 8 in the preface. And it starts with this beautiful little, the concept, the word gentleman. And so I will read a page or 2 here because I think it's fascinating, and then I'll make some comments off of this. The word gentleman originally meant something recognizable, one who had a coat of arms and some landed property. When you called someone a gentleman, you were not paying him a compliment, but merely stating a fact. If you said he was not a gentleman, you were not insulting him, but giving information. There was no contradiction in saying that John was a liar and a gentleman, any more than there is to saying that James is a fool and an M.A. But then there came people who said, so rightly, charitably, spiritually, sensibly, so anything but useful. But surely the important thing about a gentleman is not the coat of arms and the land, but the behavior. Surely he is the true gentleman who behaves as a gentleman should. Surely in the sense Edward is far more truly a gentleman than John. They meant well. To be honorable and courteous and brave is, of course, far better thing than to have a coat of arms. But it is not the same thing. Worse still, it is not a thing everyone will agree about. To call a man a gentleman in this new refined sense becomes, in fact, not a way of giving information about him, but a way of praising him. To deny that he is a gentleman becomes simply a way of insulting him. When a word ceases to be a term of description and becomes merely a term of praise, it no longer tells you facts about the objects. It only tells you about the speaker's attitude to the subject. A nice meal only means a meal the speaker likes. A gentleman, once it has been spiritualized and refined out of its old, coarse, objective sense, means hardly more than a man whom the speaker likes. As a result, gentleman is now a useless word. We had lots of terms of approval already, so it was not needed for that use. On the other hand, if anyone, say in a historical work, wants to use it in its old sense, he cannot do so without explanation. It has been spoiled for that purpose. Now, if once we allow people to start spiritualizing and refining, or as they might say, deepening, the sense of the word Christian, it too will speedily become a useless word. In the first place, Christians themselves will never be able to apply it to anyone. It is not for us to say who, in the deepest sense, is or is not close to the Spirit of Christ. We do not see into men's hearts. We cannot judge and are indeed forbidden to judge. It would be wicked arrogance for us to say that any man is or is not a Christian in this refined sense. And obviously a word which we can never apply is not going to be a very useful word. As for the unbelievers, they will no doubt cheerfully use the word in the refined sense. It will become, in their mouths, simply a term of praise. In calling anyone a Christian, they will merely mean that they think him a good man. But that way of using the word will be of no enrichment of the language, for we already have the word good. Meanwhile, the word Christian will have been spoiled for any really useful purpose it might have served. this whole premise of what he sets forth to me is just fascinating. Because, as he noted, there will come a point in time where the word Christian will mean nothing at all, or it will mean all things. And in fact, that is what truly gets me to this day, because when somebody says, I am a Christian, in our world, what does that mean? What reference does that really take hold? In the United States, when somebody says they are a Christian, it can mean just about anything. In fact, there are people now who will say, I am a Christian, and they will use it and they'll say, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. I love Jesus, but I don't love the church. And they'll utilize all these terms, but they will claim the term Christian, and it has become a useless word. And so when he defines mere Christianity, he's going to do something that's truly invaluable to us. He's going to help to redefine what the word is utilizing Scripture, what the word actually is meant to mean. And that, in and of itself, is what gives something more than what others do. You see, I could sit here and define all day long a Christian, but I will spend half my time trying to make sure people realize, well, I'm not judging, or I'm not doing this, or I don't know these people or those people, or yeah, I'm not that church. They have the same name of us, but they're different. And instead of doing the simple thing of saying, here's what I know to be true, this is what God calls a believer, a Christian. This is how God defines it. The rest will come as it will. But my role, what I am set forth to do is to be the person that God has called me to be, which is a follower of His. And with that in mind, to be a Christian must mean something particularly. It must mean something specifically. It is not a generic term for any person who claims to follow Jesus. It must mean something more than that. And it's with that in mind that we dive into the rest of the book going forward these coming weeks, these coming times. And yes, David, I also love how anti-Gnostic that passage is. It's very, very, very specific. So stop trying to spiritualize everything or find secret knowledge and meaning in all these different things. So I'm looking forward to where we're going, to what's upcoming. And I don't want to jump ahead to the next week, even though I've got all the stuff for it, because we have something to prepare for. And so if you need to know what we're reading next week, you can go and do that. You can go and find that in the group. I'll post it on this video here also and on my wall if you're watching from there, so you can see what's upcoming. I am so excited about this study, so excited about where we're going with this, and I'm so grateful for all of you tuning in tonight. It really is a pleasure to have you join me on this Thursday night. And so I just wanted to throw this to you. Thank you for being who you are, for the love that you have for the Word of God, and also to study these historical works that can encourage us. Now, and I'll note, mere Christianity is not Scripture, but it does a good job to point people to Scripture. And I'm so excited to see what might come of this. My hope is to bring in some guest speakers at different times to join me to talk through some of these fascinating points that we have coming ahead through this group. I hope you're just as excited as I am. I really can't wait for what is coming up, because this is just the beginning. This is just the first little taste of what's about to happen. And so please send me a note. Send me your thoughts. I'd love to know those. If you have any interest in joining me on one of these nights, please let me know. That would be fantastic too. Thank you for all the comments, the shares. Please feel free to share the video out. Let people know what we're doing. Invite others to come and join us along this beautiful study together. I cannot wait to see you all next week. Until then, God bless. If you have anything, if I can serve you anyway, please let me know. Until then, be safe, enjoy life, and truly serve God to the best of your abilities. We'll see you then.